February 7, 1943. Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh pulled his F-4U Corsair into a climbing turn at 14,000 feet, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine thundering with 2,000 horsepower behind 17 feet of aircraft nose. Below him, 4 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters moved in formation, their pilots confident, experienced, veterans of campaigns from China to the Philippines to the Solomons. Walsh had been flying Corsairs for exactly 3 weeks. The Zero pilots saw him. Walsh knew they saw him. He watched them break formation with the casual precision of men who had done this hundreds of times before, splitting into 2 pairs, beginning the climbing spiral that would bring them above and behind the American fighter. It was the same tactical maneuver that had killed dozens of Allied pilots in the 18 months since Pearl Harbor, the same maneuver that had established the Zero as the most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific, the same maneuver that assumed the laws of aerial combat were fixed and immutable. Walsh pushed his throttle forward and pointed the Corsair's nose at the climbing Zeros. The engine roared. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 knots, 320, 340. The Corsair accelerated with a violence that would have torn the wings off a Zero. Walsh closed the distance in seconds, fired a burst from his 650 caliber machine guns, and watched one Zero trailing smoke fall away toward the jungle below. He pulled up, reversed, and dove on the second pair before they could react. Another burst, another Zero falling. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The remaining 2 Zeros scattered. Walsh pursued, keeping his speed high, using the Corsair's power to dictate the engagement. Within 3 minutes of first contact, all 4 Zeros were either destroyed or fleeing. Walsh returned to Henderson Field with bullet holes in his wing, his fuel low, and a fundamental question burning in his mind. Had the war just changed, or had it always been this way, and nobody told the Zero pilots? For 18 months, Japanese Navy pilots flying the Mitsubishi, a 6M0 had dominated Pacific skies, with a combination of maneuverability, range, and tactical doctrine that made them nearly invincible in skilled hands. They had destroyed Allied air forces in the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. They had achieved kill ratios that approached 10-1 in some engagements. They had created a psychological aura of superiority that affected Allied pilots before combat even began. American pilots were told explicitly, "Do not dogfight with Zeros. You will lose." The Corsair that Walsh flew that day represented engineering decisions made 3 years earlier by engineers at Vought Aircraft, who had been given a simple directive: build the most powerful fighter aircraft possible around the most powerful engine available. The result was an airplane that weighed 60% more than a Zero, carried twice the ammunition, flew 50 miles per hour faster, and could dive at speeds that would cause a Zero's control surfaces to lock up from aerodynamic stress. It was not more maneuverable. It was not more elegant. It was simply more powerful in ways that changed the fundamental mathematics of aerial combat. The Mitsubishi, a 6M0 that entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1940, had been designed according to principles that prioritized specific capabilities above all others: range, maneuverability, and climb rate. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi had been given requirements that seemed impossible. Build a carrier-based fighter that could escort bombers on missions exceeding 1,000 miles, outmaneuver any existing fighter aircraft, and climb to 20,000 feet in under 8 minutes. Horikoshi's solution was elegant and ruthless: eliminate everything unnecessary. The Zero carried no armor protection for the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its airframe was built from the lightest aluminum alloys available, with structural members machined to minimum thickness. The aircraft's skin was so thin that maintenance crews were cautioned against leaning on it. The engine, a Nakajima NK-1C Sakai producing just under 1,000 horsepower, was matched to a large propeller and an airframe so light that the power-to-weight ratio allowed extraordinary performance. The result was an aircraft that weighed just 4,000 pounds empty and 6,000 pounds loaded for combat, A contemporary American F-4F Wildcat weighed 7,300 pounds loaded. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter, could climb faster, could fly farther. In the hands of pilots who had been training since the mid-1930s, who had combat experience from China, who understood the tactical doctrine of energy management and position, the Zero was devastating. When Japanese naval aviation struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Zero pilots of the 1st Air Fleet had an average of 800 flight hours. Many had combat experience. They flew in coordinated formations, communicated effectively, and executed tactical plans with precision. American pilots at Pearl Harbor, many of whom were recent flight school graduates, were slaughtered on the ground or overwhelmed in the air by aircraft they had never encountered and tactics they didn't understand. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. In the Philippines, Major General Louis Brereton's Far East Air Force was destroyed, mostly on the ground, with surviving American pilots reporting that the Japanese fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots of extraordinary skill. In Malaya, RAF Brewster Buffalo fighters were shot down in numbers that approached total losses. Over Burma, the American volunteer group led by Claire Chennault developed hit-and-run tactics, specifically to avoid turning fights with Zeros, understanding that maneuverability combat meant death. The Zero's reputation grew with each victory. Allied intelligence initially refused to believe performance reports, assuming pilots were exaggerating. When a relatively intact Zero was recovered from the Aleutians in July 1942 and tested by American pilots, the results confirmed what combat survivors had been reporting. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange every American fighter in service. The testing report concluded with recommendations that would define Allied fighter tactics for the next year: maintain speed, use altitude advantage, never attempt sustained turning combat, hit and run only. Japanese pilots understood their advantage and exploited it with tactical doctrine refined through years of combat. The standard Zero formation was a loose V with aircraft spaced widely enough to maintain visual contact while covering each other. When engaging enemy fighters, Zero pilots would use superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage, then dive on opponents from above and behind. If the enemy turned to fight, the Zero's superior maneuverability allowed pilots to get inside the turn radius and bring guns to bear. If the enemy fled, the Zero's range allowed extended pursuit. The philosophical difference between Japanese and American fighter design in 1941 was not simply a matter of technical choices. It represented fundamentally different assumptions about what determined victory in aerial combat. Japanese designers, influenced by their experience in China and by naval doctrine emphasizing offensive operations across vast Pacific distances, believed that maneuverability and range were paramount. An aircraft that could outturn its opponent would win the turning fight. An aircraft that could fly 1,000 miles would control a larger area of ocean. This belief was reinforced by every combat report from China, where Japanese fighters had dominated Chinese and Soviet aircraft. It was validated by war games and training exercises, where experienced Japanese pilots in maneuverable aircraft consistently defeated less experienced opponents in heavier fighters. The design philosophy became doctrine: build light, agile aircraft, and train pilots to exploit maneuverability advantage through superior skill and tactics. American design philosophy in the late 1930s had emphasized different priorities, though not yet the priorities that would eventually win the Pacific Air War. The Brewster Buffalo and Grumman F-4F Wildcat had been designed with some attention to pilot protection and structural strength, but both were underpowered relative to their weight. The Buffalo's Wright R-1820 engine produced just 1,200 horsepower. The Wildcat's Pratt Whitney R-1830 produced 1,000 horsepower. Both aircraft were slower than the Zero and far less maneuverable. The turning point in American fighter design philosophy came not from combat experience, but from a specification issued by the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics on February 1, 1938. The specification, which would lead to the F-4U Corsair, requested proposals for a single-seat carrier fighter with maximum speed, maximum climb rate, and maximum practical range. Crucially, the specification emphasized that speed and climb rate took priority over maneuverability. The Navy wanted an interceptor that could reach attacking bombers quickly and fight at high altitude. Vaught's chief designer, Rex Bizel, approached the problem by selecting the most powerful engine available, the experimental Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that produced 2,000 horsepower. Everything else in the design flowed from that decision. To absorb 2,000 horsepower efficiently, Bizel specified a 13-foot 4-inch diameter propeller, the largest ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. To provide ground clearance for that massive propeller while keeping the landing gear short enough for carrier operations, he designed inverted gull wings that lowered the wing's attachment point to the fuselage. The resulting aircraft was large by fighter standards. The prototype XF-4U-1 first flew on May 29, 1940, and immediately demonstrated performance that exceeded every specification. Maximum speed was 405 miles per hour. Initial climb rate was 3,100 feet per minute. Service ceiling was 36,900 feet. The test pilot, Lyman A. Bullard Jr., reported that the aircraft handled well, accelerated dramatically, and had control response that remained positive at speeds where other fighters' controls became mushy or locked up. But the Corsair also revealed problems that would delay its entry into combat. The long nose restricted forward visibility during landing approach, making carrier landings dangerous. The landing gear's oleo struts bounced on carrier deck landings, causing the aircraft to porpoise. The cockpit was positioned so far back that pilots had difficulty judging altitude during approach. Stall characteristics were vicious, with the left wing dropping suddenly and without warning. These problems required extensive modifications and delayed carrier qualification until April 1944, long after the aircraft had entered combat from land bases. The F-4U Corsair entered combat service not with the Navy squadrons for which it was designed, but with Marine Corps aviation units operating from land bases in the Solomon Islands. The Navy's carrier qualification issues meant that Marine squadrons received the first production Corsairs beginning in October 1942. Marine Fighter Squadron 2-1-4 VMF 2-14, commanded by Major Gregory Boyington, would become the first unit to take Corsairs into sustained combat against zero-equipped Japanese squadrons. The pilots of VMF 2-14 were experienced aviators, many with combat time in F-4F Wildcats, but they had to relearn aerial combat tactics built around the Corsair's specific capabilities. The aircraft they received was fundamentally different from anything they had flown. The F-4U-1A variant weighed 9,205 pounds empty and 14,000 pounds fully loaded for combat. It carried 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total. The ammunition alone weighed 400 pounds. The armor plate protecting the pilot's seat and back weighed another 165 pounds. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine behind that long nose generated 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, maintained 1,800 horsepower at 15,000 feet, and could be pushed to 2,250 horsepower for short periods using water injection. The propeller, a Hamilton Standard 3-blade unit, was 13 feet 4 inches in diameter and weighed 384 pounds. Engine and propeller together weighed over 3,000 pounds, almost as much as an entire Zero airframe. Performance reflected this massive power plant. Maximum speed at 19,900 feet was 417 miles per hour. The Corsair could maintain 380 miles per hour at 20,000 feet indefinitely. Climb rate was 3,120 feet per minute at sea level, declining to 1,950 feet per minute at 20,000 feet. Service ceiling was 36,900 feet. Maximum range with drop tanks was 1,560 miles. Compare these specifications to the A6M50 variant that Japanese Navy squadrons were flying by mid-1943. The Zero weighed 4,136 pounds empty and 6,254 pounds loaded. The Nakajima Sakai engine produced 1,130 horsepower at takeoff and 1,000 horsepower at 15,000 feet. The aircraft carried two Type 99 20mm cannons with 100 rounds each and two Type 97 7.7mm machine guns with 600 rounds each. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Maximum speed was 351 miles per hour at 19,680 feet. Climb rate was 3,940 feet per minute at sea level. Service ceiling was 38,500 feet. Maximum range was 1,940 miles. On paper, the Zero maintained advantages in climb rate, service ceiling, range, and most critically, in turning radius. The Zero's wing-loading aircraft weight divided by wing area was 21 pounds per square foot. The Corsair's wing loading was 34 pounds per square foot. In a sustained turning fight at moderate speeds, the Zero could turn inside the Corsair every time. Japanese pilots knew this. They had spent 2 years proving it against Wildcats, P-40 Warhawks, and every other Allied fighter they encountered. What the specifications didn't fully capture was the Corsair's performance at high speed. The Zero's light construction and fabric-covered control surfaces meant that above 350 miles per hour, aileron forces became extremely heavy and elevator response slowed dangerously. At 400 miles per hour, a speed the Zero could only reach in a dive, the control surfaces were nearly immovable. Japanese pilots had to throttle back before attempting high-speed maneuvers. The Corsair's all-metal construction and hydraulically boosted controls remained responsive at 420 miles per hour. Corsair pilots could maneuver violently at speeds where Zero pilots had to fly straight. The tactical implications were profound, but not immediately obvious. Marine Corps doctrine for Corsair employment was still evolving in early 1943. Initial combat reports from VMF 214 and VMF 212 emphasized the Corsair's speed and climb advantages, but cautioned pilots to avoid turning engagements. The ghost of the Zero's reputation persisted. Pilots who had survived 18 months of combat in inferior aircraft carried psychological scars. They had watched friends die in turning fights. They had memorized the rule: never dogfight with Zeros. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who would eventually be credited with 21 confirmed victories flying Corsairs, later described his first month of Corsair combat as a process of discovering capabilities that doctrine hadn't yet articulated. The aircraft could do things that shouldn't work. It could accelerate in a dive past speeds where Zeros came apart. It could reverse direction using rolls that leveraged power rather than lift. It could sustain high G turns at speeds above 350 miles per hour, where the Zero's turn radius advantage disappeared. The Corsair wasn't more maneuverable than the Zero. It redefined what maneuverability meant. The concentrated aerial battles over Rabaul between September 1943 and February 1944 provided the crucible where Japanese Zero pilots confronted the reality that their tactical and technological advantages had vanished. Rabaul, located on the northeastern tip of New Britain, was Japan's largest air and naval base in the South Pacific. By mid-1943, Japanese 11th Air Fleet headquartered there fielded over 300 aircraft, including approximately 200 Zeros, flown by pilots ranging from combat veterans with hundreds of hours to recent graduates with minimal training. The American strategy was systematic destruction. 5th Air Force bombers escorted by P-38 Lightnings struck from New Guinea. Marine Corps and Navy squadrons flying Corsairs and Hellcats struck from bases in the Solomons. The attacks came daily, sometimes multiple times per day, forcing Japanese fighters to intercept under conditions that negated their tactical advantages. The Zero's range, so valuable for offensive operations across vast ocean distances, meant nothing when defending a fixed base. The Zero's climb rate advantage was minimized when American formations approached at 20,000 feet or higher. On October 24, 1943, Marine Major Robert E. Gaylor led a flight of 8 Corsairs from VMF 224 in a sweep over Rabaul. They encountered approximately 30 Zeros at 18,000 feet. The engagement that followed lasted 12 minutes and resulted in 9 confirmed 0 kills against no American losses. Gaylor's after-action report, preserved in Marine Corps archives, describes the engagement in clinical detail that reveals the tactical shift that had occurred. The Zeros attempted their standard climbing spiral to gain altitude advantage. Gaylor's flight maintained speed and altitude, refusing the climbing fight. When the Zeros reached approximately 22,000 feet and began their diving attack, the Corsairs dove away, building speed to over 400 miles per hour. The Zeros followed but couldn't keep pace. Their lighter construction and lower power meant they accelerated more slowly in the dive. By the time the Corsairs pulled out at 8,000 feet and reversed course, they had opened the range to over 2 miles. The Zeros were still diving, committed to intercepts that no longer existed. Gaylor's flight climbed back to altitude using the Corsairs' superior power-to-weight ratio at high speed. The Zeros, having burned energy in the dive and subsequent pullout, couldn't match the climb rate. Within 3 minutes, the Corsairs were above the Zeros again. This time, when they dove on targets that couldn't escape. The engagement became a series of high-speed passes where Corsairs attacked, climbed away using superior power, repositioned, and attacked again. Zero pilots attempting to turn into the attacks found themselves turning against aircraft that were already gone, accelerating away at speeds the Zero couldn't match. Japanese pilot accounts from Naval survivors describe the psychological impact of these engagements. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with 64 confirmed victories, flew Zeros over Rabaul through November 1943. In his post-war memoir, Samurai, Sakai describes encounters with Corsairs as fundamentally different from previous combat. American pilots no longer fled from Zeros. They attacked aggressively, used speed to dictate engagement terms, and refused turning fights that would have given Zeros advantages. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Sakai's account details a specific engagement on November 11, 1943, where his 8-plane Zero formation intercepted 12 Corsairs escorting B-25 bombers. The Zeros climbed to attack. The Corsairs jettisoned their drop tanks and dove on the climbing Zeros with a speed advantage of at least 80 miles per hour. Sakai watched his wingman's aircraft disintegrate under .50 caliber fire before he could shout a warning. He rolled right, pulled hard, and blacked out from G-forces. When his vision cleared 3 seconds later, the Corsairs were gone, already climbing back to altitude. The entire engagement from first contact to Corsair withdrawal had lasted less than 30 seconds. Part 6. Evidence Accumulation. Kill Ratios. The statistical evidence of the Corsairs' dominance emerged, gradually through 1944 as combat reports accumulated and intelligence analysts compiled kill ratios. The numbers were unambiguous. From February 1943 through August 1945, Corsair squadrons achieved an overall kill ratio of 11.0 to 1. For every Corsair lost in air-to-air combat, 11 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. This ratio held across different theaters, different pilot experience levels, and different tactical situations. Marine Corps squadrons flying Corsairs from Solomon Islands bases between February and December 1943 recorded 284 confirmed kills against 23 Corsairs lost to enemy fighters. The ratio was 12.3 to 1. Navy squadrons operating Corsairs from carriers after April 1944 recorded similar numbers. Fighter Squadron 17, VF-17, the famous Jolly Rogers Squadron, destroyed 154 Japanese aircraft during its first combat deployment against 12 losses, a ratio of 12.8 to 1. Individual pilot performance reflected the aircraft's capabilities. Second Lieutenant Robert M. Hansen of VMF-215 was credited with 25 confirmed victories in Corsairs during a 6-month period before being killed by ground fire in February 1944. Major Gregory Boyington, commanding VMF-214, was credited with 22 victories in Corsairs before being shot down over Rabaul in January 1944. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh achieved 21 victories. The list of Corsair Aces pilots with 5 or more confirmed kills exceeded 120 names by war's end. Japanese records, where they survive, corroborate these numbers from the opposite perspective. Japanese 11th Air Fleet, which defended Rabaul, began operations in mid-1942 with approximately 240 aircraft, including 160 Zeros. By February 1944, when Japanese forces evacuated Rabaul, surviving aircraft numbered fewer than 30. Personnel losses were catastrophic. Of approximately 300 Japanese naval aviators assigned to Rabaul defense between September 1943 and February 1944, more than 200 died or were reported missing. Many were veterans who could not be replaced. The mathematical reality was that Japanese pilot training could not keep pace with losses. In 1941, Japanese Navy pilot training required 18 to 24 months and produced pilots with over 300 flight hours before combat assignment. By 1944, training time had been compressed to 4 to 6 months, with pilots graduating with fewer than 100 flight hours. These inadequately trained pilots faced American aviators flying aircraft with decisive performance advantages. The outcome was predetermined. Zero production numbers tell part of the story. Mitsubishi and Nakajima manufactured 10,430 Zeros between 1940 and 1945. Approximately 6,000 were destroyed in combat or lost to operational accidents. But production numbers meant nothing if trained pilots didn't exist to fly them. By late 1944, Japanese air bases had Zeros that couldn't be flown because qualified pilots didn't exist. Aircraft sat on ramps, carefully maintained by ground crews, waiting for pilots who were already dead. American industrial capacity compounded Japanese problems. Vought manufactured 12,571 Corsairs between 1942 and 1945. Goodyear manufactured 4,014 under license. Brewster manufactured 735 before production issues led to contract cancellation. Total Corsair production exceeded 13,000 aircraft. More Corsairs were built than Zeros, and Corsairs were larger, more complex, and required more resources per unit. The disparity extended beyond aircraft to ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and pilot training. American 50 caliber ammunition production exceeded 12 billion rounds during the war. Japanese 20mm cannon ammunition production totaled approximately 100 million rounds. American aviation fuel production exceeded 20 billion gallons. Japanese aviation fuel production, constrained by oil shortages after American submarines destroyed tanker traffic, fell below 500 million gallons by 1944. Every aspect of the industrial competition favored American forces. Japanese Zero pilots, who survived 1944 encounters with Corsairs, carried knowledge that Japanese tactical advantages had evaporated. The ocean and sky that Japanese naval aviation had dominated in 1942 belonged to American forces by mid-1944. The reasons were mathematical, industrial, and technological. American aircraft were more powerful. American pilots were better trained. American supply chains never failed. American industrial capacity produced aircraft, ammunition, and fuel faster than combat consumed them. Japanese advantages in maneuverability and range meant nothing against opponents who refused to fight on Japanese terms and who possessed the speed and power to dictate engagement conditions. By mid-1944, Japanese naval aviation had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The carrier battles at Philippine Sea in June 1944, what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese air power. Of approximately 450 Japanese carrier aircraft launched against Task Force 58, more than 350 were destroyed. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. The kill ratio of 12-1 matched Corsair combat statistics precisely. The Japanese pilots who died for the Philippine Sea were not cowards. Many were inadequately trained, thrust into combat with fewer than 100 flight hours total, but they followed their orders and attacked American formations with whatever courage and skill they possessed. They died because they flew aircraft that had been technologically surpassed, and because Japanese industrial capacity could not produce the replacement pilots, aircraft, fuel, or ammunition needed to sustain combat operations against American material superiority. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai survived the war, one of perhaps 300 Japanese naval aviators who flew combat throughout the entire Pacific War and lived to see surrender. His post-war writings describe the psychological transformation of Japanese pilots between 1942 and 1945. The confidence of early war veterans, men who believed their aircraft and tactics were superior, gave way to resignation among 1944 pilots who understood they were being sent to die in aircraft that couldn't compete. Sakai describes conversations with young pilots at Yokosuka Air Base in early 1945. These men, fresh from abbreviated training, asked veterans about American aircraft capabilities. They wanted to know if the stories were true, that American fighters were faster, more powerful, better armed. Sakai told them the truth. American Corsairs and Hellcats possessed decisive performance advantages. Japanese pilots could still win individual engagements through superior tactics and skill, but statistical odds favored American pilots overwhelmingly. The young pilots listened, understood, and flew their missions anyway. Most died within weeks. The institutional response to technological inferiority came too late and addressed wrong problems. Japanese engineers developed the A-7M Reppu fighter, intended as the Zero's successor, with a 2,000 horsepower Nakajima Homare engine and performance specifications matching American fighters. The prototype flew in May 1944. Production delays, material shortages, and Allied bombing meant that fewer than 10 reached operational units before war's end. The J-2M Raiden interceptor, designed for high-altitude performance, entered service in limited numbers, but suffered reliability problems that kept it from effectiveness. More fundamentally, Japanese industry could not produce advanced aircraft in quantities needed. American factories manufactured 96,318 fighter aircraft between 1941 and 1945. Japanese factories manufactured 30,306 fighters during the same period. American production exceeded Japanese production by more than 3-to-1. When production quality is considered, American fighters with armor, self-sealing tanks, sophisticated fire control systems versus late-war Japanese fighters built with inferior materials and simplified systems, the disparity grows larger. The Kaiten Special Attack Unit's kamikaze operations represented final admission that Japanese aviation could no longer compete conventionally. If Japanese pilots could not survive long enough to damage American ships through normal combat, then suicide attacks offered last resort. The logic was brutal and mathematically sound. One aircraft, one pilot, one chance to cause damage before inevitable death. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze attacks. They sank approximately 50 Allied ships and damaged approximately 300 more. The exchange rate was worse than conventional combat, but conventional combat had already proven unsustainable. The men who died in these attacks were not fanatics divorced from reality. Many were rational actors who understood Japan's military situation was hopeless and who chose to die in ways they believed served their nation and honored their training. Their letters home, preserved in Japanese archives, express not enthusiasm but resignation. They knew they were dying for a cause already lost. They died anyway because military honor and social pressure demanded it. The technological inferiority that made kamikaze tactics necessary was understood by pilots who flew them. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who led the first organized kamikaze attack on October 25, 1944, told a reporter before his mission, "Japan's future is bleak if it is forced to kill one of its best pilots. I am not going on this mission for the Emperor or for the Empire. I am going because I was ordered to." Seki flew a Zero loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb into the escort carrier USS St. Lo, sinking it. His death was tactically successful and strategically meaningless. American industrial capacity replaced St. Lo within months. Japan could not replace Seki or the thousands of pilots who followed him. The F-4U Corsair remained in production until December 1952, with the last aircraft delivered to French naval aviation. Total production reached 12,571 aircraft across all variants. The aircraft served with distinction in Korea, where Corsairs flew ground attack missions and achieved several air-to-air victories against North Korean aircraft. The last operational Corsair combat mission was flown by French forces during the 1954 siege of Dien Bien Phu. The aircraft's combat career spanned 12 years, exceptional longevity for a design that first flew in 1940. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from its 1944 collapse. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, approximately 5,000 operational Japanese aircraft remained, including perhaps 1,000 fighters. Most were hidden at dispersed airfields, camouflaged against American bombing, waiting for the final homeland defense that never came. Fuel shortages meant many couldn't fly even if pilots existed. The aircraft were scrapped during occupation, their aluminum melted down, their technology studied by American engineers who found little worth incorporating into American designs. The technological lessons shaped post-war American naval aviation. The Navy's conclusion was unambiguous. Engine power determined fighter performance more than any other single factor. Post-war American fighters, the F-8 F Bearcat, F-9 F Panther, F-4D Skyray, prioritized powerful engines over all other considerations. The philosophy of building fighters around the most powerful available engine became doctrine. Jets replaced pistons, but the principle remained. Power enables tactical flexibility, and tactical flexibility wins engagements. Japanese post-war aviation industry faced different challenges. The American occupation prohibited Japanese aircraft production until 1952. When production resumed, Japanese companies built American-designed aircraft under license. F-86 Sabres, F-104 Starfighters, 4 Phantoms. Indigenous Japanese fighter design didn't resume until the 1970s with the Mitsubishi phone, which incorporated American engines and fire control systems. The tradition of Japanese fighter design that had produced the Zero ended with Japan's defeat. The psychological legacy among surviving Japanese pilots manifested in various ways. Some, like Saburo Sakai, wrote extensively about their experiences, attempting to explain what had happened and why Japan lost. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to discuss their wartime service. The Japanese Naval Aviation Veterans Association, formed in the 1950s, focused on remembering fallen comrades rather than analyzing tactical or technological failures. The pain of defeat was too recent, too personal. American Corsair pilots faced different post-war trajectories. Many remained in naval aviation, serving through Korea and into the jet age. Their combat experience shaped tactical doctrine for generations. The lessons they learned use speed and power to dictate engagement terms, refuse fights on enemy terms, leverage technological advantages ruthlessly became foundational principles of American fighter doctrine. The kill ratios they achieved validated the engineering decisions made in 1938 when Vought designers chose to build the most powerful fighter possible. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum preserves a Vought F-4U-1D Corsair, Bureau number 82079, flown by Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh during his combat tour. The aircraft bears the markings of VMF-224 and shows 13 Japanese flags painted below the cockpit, representing Walsh's confirmed victories. The museum display includes Walsh's flight logbook, his after-action reports, and technical manuals for the R-2800 engine. Visitors can see the physical evidence of technological superiority: the massive propeller, the 650 caliber guns, the armor plate that protected Walsh through dozens of combat missions. No equivalent Japanese museum display exists that honestly confronts the Zero's technological obsolescence. Japanese war museums focus on sacrifice and suffering rather than tactical or technological analysis. The Yasukuni Shrine Museum in Tokyo displays a Zero, but the accompanying text emphasizes the pilot's courage and devotion rather than examining why courage proved insufficient. The gap between American triumphalism and Japanese reluctance to analyze defeat reflects different cultural approaches to military history. Americans celebrate technological achievement, Japanese commemorate sacrifice. Neither fully captures the human reality of men who flew, fought, and too often died in aircraft whose capabilities determined outcomes before combat began. The surviving Corsair pilots, men like Kenneth Walsh, who lived until 2003, reaching age 89, carried knowledge that technology and industrial capacity had won their war as surely as courage or skill. They had been given aircraft superior to anything their opponents flew. They had been trained thoroughly. They had been supplied lavishly. They had won because their nation's industrial and technological capabilities exceeded their enemies' capabilities overwhelmingly. The victory was earned through combat, but it was enabled by factories, engineers, and resources their opponents could not match. The story of Japanese Zero pilots confronting American Corsairs is ultimately a story about the mathematics of technological competition in industrial warfare. Two nations entered war with different design philosophies, different industrial capacities, and different strategic priorities. One nation built light, maneuverable fighters optimized for offensive operations by highly trained pilots. The other nation built powerful, durable fighters optimized for tactical flexibility and industrial mass production. The outcome was determined not by courage, both sides demonstrated extraordinary courage, but by which design philosophy better matched the material realities of prolonged industrial war. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh's encounter over Guadalcanal in February 1943, where he destroyed 4 Zeros in 3 minutes, represented the moment when tactical reality caught up with technological change. The Zero pilots who died that day flew their aircraft skillfully. They executed the climbing spiral that had worked hundreds of times before. They attempted to leverage their maneuverability advantage through positioning and teamwork. They did everything their training and experience told them was correct. They died because the rules of aerial combat had changed in ways their doctrine hadn't yet acknowledged. The change was not subtle. The Corsair didn't outmaneuver the Zero. It didn't need to. It outpowered the Zero by 85%. It outgunned the Zero with 6 heavy machine guns versus 2 cannons and 2 light machine guns. It protected its pilot with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. It accelerated faster, dived faster, climbed faster at high speed, and sustained higher speeds in level flight. Every performance metric that mattered in high-speed combat favored the Corsair. The only metrics that favored the Zero turning radius at moderate speed, climb rate from sea level, range, were metrics that mattered primarily in slow-speed turning fights that Corsair pilots could refuse. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was cumulative rather than instantaneous. Individual engagements could be explained by circumstances: altitude disadvantage, numerical inferiority, surprise, but as engagements accumulated through 1943 and into 1944, patterns became undeniable. American fighters attacked aggressively. They maintained speed. They refused turning engagements. They climbed away after attacks using power that Zeros couldn't match. They appeared in increasing numbers, flown by pilots whose training was adequate, even if not exceptional, supplied by logistics that never faltered. Japanese pilots gradually understood they were not just fighting superior aircraft. They were fighting an industrial system that produced superior aircraft faster than combat, consumed them, trained replacement pilots continuously, supplied forward bases lavishly, and maintained overwhelming material advantages at every level of warfare. The Corsair was not merely a good aircraft. It was a symbol of industrial capacity that Japan could not match. Every Corsair encountered represented factories that operated around the clock, supply chains that spanned oceans, resources that seemed inexhaustible. The 11-to-1 kill ratio that Corsairs achieved was not primarily about aircraft performance. It was about systematic advantages, compounded across training, logistics, intelligence, tactics, and technology. American pilots flew better aircraft. They were better trained with more flight hours before combat. They were better informed through intelligence that broke Japanese codes. They were better supplied with ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. They operated within tactical doctrine that leveraged their advantages and minimized their weaknesses. Every factor favored American success. For the Japanese pilots who survived to witness these accumulated advantages, the realization was psychologically devastating. They had not been defeated by warriors superior in courage or skill. They had been defeated by an industrial system whose output exceeded their nation's capacity to respond. The sky, which had belonged to Japanese naval aviation in 1942, belonged to American aviation by 1944. The transition was not a single dramatic moment, but a cumulative process where every combat report, every encounter, every narrow escape reinforced the same lesson. The enemy possessed decisive advantages that Japanese forces could not overcome through better tactics or greater devotion. The ocean and sky that Commander Uno Kameyo's submarine had navigated in darkness, that Japanese Zero pilots had dominated in early war, were no longer Japanese domains by mid-1944. They belonged to the nation that built the sonobuoys that tracked submarines, the Corsairs that hunted Zeros, the radar systems that saw beyond visual range, the industrial capacity that produced weapons and supplies faster than combat consumed them. American technological and industrial superiority manifested in every domain of warfare simultaneously because it stemmed from fundamental advantages in resources, industrial organization, scientific research, and economic capacity. The Japanese submariners who heard American sonobuoys and realized they were being tracked by invisible technology experienced the same psychological shock as Zero pilots who watched Corsairs accelerate away at speeds they couldn't match. Both groups confronted evidence that their enemy possessed capabilities they couldn't counter. Both groups continued fighting because duty and honor demanded it. Both groups understood, with increasing clarity, that their cause was mathematically hopeless. The courage they demonstrated in continuing to fight despite this knowledge deserves recognition separate from judgment about the war's outcome or justice. When the last Corsair combat mission was flown in 1954, and the last surviving Zero pilots gathered to remember fallen comrades, the technological story was complete, but the human story continued. The men who flew these aircraft, American and Japanese, carried memories of aerial combat, where technological advantages determined outcomes as surely as skill or courage. They understood what historians sometimes obscure, that industrial warfare is won by industrial capacity, that technological competition determines tactical possibilities, and that courage and determination, while necessary, are insufficient when material disparities are profound. The sky belonged to those who built the engines, the factories, the supply chains, and the training programs that produced superior pilots, flying superior aircraft supported by superior logistics. The mathematics of air combat in World War II demonstrated what subsequent conflicts would confirm. In industrial warfare between peer powers, the nation with greater industrial capacity and technological sophistication possesses decisive advantages that courage alone cannot overcome. That lesson, learned painfully by Japanese pilots between 1943 and 1945, remains relevant in any era when nations compete through technology and industrial production. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.